It began on a night when the sky refused to stay quiet. A night when the wind carried whispers, and death rode on horseback. Out here, in the forgotten plains, power is measured not by law, but by the sound of a gun. And on this night, 7 men came to take what wasn't theirs. They came laughing. They came confident. They came believing they were untouchable. What they didn't know was that the ranch they were riding toward belonged to a woman who had already survived hell. Her name is in Washington, 68 years old. A quiet, black widow living on a ranch most people in this town pretend doesn't exist. But behind those calm, wrinkled eyes hides something they never expected. A past soaked in desert sand and gunpowder. A name that once sent fear into the hearts of men halfway across the world. They thought she was weak. They thought she was alone. They thought wrong. By the time the sun rises, not all of them will be breathing. But this isn't just a story about revenge. This is a story about memory, about pain, about what happens when the system turns its back on justice. So before we enter this long night, I need you to lean in, because every shadow has a past. And in Washington's past is about to awaken. If you're ready for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Like this video if your heart's already racing. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if the law failed to protect you? Now let's go back to the night the cowboys came. The ranch sits on the farthest edge of the county. A stretch of dry earth, cracked fences, and stubborn grass. Most people drive past it without looking twice. But those who do never forget it. Locals call it the widow's land. Not because it's cursed, but because the woman who owns it doesn't speak much. And when she does, people listen. Every morning, and Washington steps out onto that porch like clockwork. Same chair. Same coffee mug. Same quiet stare across the fields. She doesn't wave. She doesn't smile. She just watches. Watching is what kept her alive. Out there, in the dust, she finds peace. Or something close to it. But in a town that thrives on whispers, silence is a dangerous thing. In the bar down on 4th Street, in the dusty aisles of the feed store, and even in the church pews on Sunday mornings, they talk about her. Some say she's a witch. Others claim she buried gold somewhere on the land. And a few claim they saw her shoot a rattlesnake clean through the eye from 50 yards away. But among the men who wear hats too big and guns too loose, rumors turn to plans. Men like Cole Briggs. Cole doesn't just run with the cowboys. He leads them. The kind of man who doesn't need the law, because the law bends to him. His family's been tied to this town for decades. Old money. Dirty power. When black farmers lost their land, Cole's father bought it for pennies. Cole and his crew, 6 men with whiskey for blood and cruelty for sport, have made a name terrorizing black families on the edges of town. Beatings. Threats. Burned fences. And no one, not one single soul in uniform, ever held them accountable. Because when Cole walks into the sheriff's office, he doesn't knock. He pours himself a drink. He shakes hands with the men in charge. And just like that, laws disappear. So when Cole heard the whispers about N's land, about the quiet black widow with no family, his grin stretched wide. He told his crew they'd ride out one night, scare her off, and take what they wanted. He said it would be easy. Because in their world, black land doesn't stay black for long. What Cole didn't know, what none of them knew, is that the quietest places often hide the loudest ghosts. And Washington's land isn't just dirt and fence posts. It's ground she bled for. And no cowboy's boots would take it without a fight. She's lived in this silence for years. Long enough to watch generations come and go. Long enough to see the hatred in their sons' eyes look exactly like it did in their fathers. Long enough to know history has a cruel way of repeating itself. But if history repeats itself, so does resistance. And in Anne's case, resistance carries a rifle. The town's whispers reached the cowboys. And soon enough, the cowboys' whispers reached Anne. But she didn't flinch. She didn't call for help. She didn't run. She just sat on that porch, watching the horizon, like a sniper watching for the first movement in a kill zone. This is where the story begins to shift. Before the shots, before the blood, before the storm. Because evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it rides toward you. If you were sitting on that porch, and you knew the men coming your way had the law in their pockets, what would you do? Run, fight, or wait, like a ghost with a loaded gun? Tell me in the comments what you'd do. On a hot and hollow afternoon, when the sun burned like judgment, they came, not like shadows, Not like thieves, but like men who believed the world belonged to them. The first 3 rode in slow, boots scraping the ground, eyes scanning the house that hadn't changed in years. The other 4 waited at the fence line, fingers on triggers, smiles on their faces. And Washington didn't panic. She didn't run inside. She simply lowered her coffee cup and watched. To them, she looked like a frail, lonely black woman on her porch. But what they couldn't see was how every step they took, every breath they drew, was already being measured. Old habits never die, especially not sniper habits. She noted the leader first. Cole Briggs, chin tilted up, walked too proud, the kind of man who doesn't ask. He takes. Then the others, jittery hands, guns sitting loose on their belts. 2 of them scanning the barn like they'd already claimed it. She clocked them in silence. 1, 2, 3, 7. Cole was the first to speak. His voice cut through the heat like a knife dipped in poison. She didn't respond. She let him talk. Because in war, the one who listens longest fires last. They pretended they were here to buy cattle, but their eyes gave them away. They didn't look at the livestock. They looked at her land. They looked at the porch like they were already tearing it down. They looked at her like she was a weed to be pulled. And in that silence, her mind betrayed her. Just for a second, she was no longer on her porch. She was in a war zone, Afghanistan, a dirt hill beneath her, rifle pressed to her cheek. Voices in a language she didn't speak. And the same kind of laughter. She remembered what came after that laughter. One of the younger cowboys leaned on her fence post, spat on the ground, and whispered something he thought she couldn't hear. A word that carried centuries of venom. Her jaw clenched. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, focused, like it always did before a shot. That was the moment everything changed. They thought she was intimidated, but what they saw in her eyes wasn't fear. It was calculation. They just didn't recognize it, because they'd never been on the wrong end of a sniper's stare. Cole tipped his hat, threw her a smile soaked in arrogance, and said they'd be seeing her around. They turned their horses, dust swirling around their boots. But make no mistake, this wasn't a visit. This was a warning. As they rode off, and stayed seated, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands still. She'd seen that look before, men claiming territory with nothing but their skin and their power. And she'd learned something the hard way. Men like that don't talk twice. The next time they come, they don't knock. But it wasn't the same woman they thought they could scare. Under the floorboards of that house sat a rifle wrapped in an old wool cloth. A rifle that once belonged to a soldier who never missed. And in her heart, beneath years of silence, something old began to stir. The town had its stories. The cowboys had their plans. But in Washington, she had a past. And that past was starting to breathe again. If men like Cole Briggs showed up at your door, not just to steal your land, but your dignity, what would you do? Run, fight, or wait for the darkness to come so you can meet it on your terms? Tell me in the comments what you would do. Some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others creep in quietly, waiting for the world to fall asleep. For in Washington, the storm didn't come all at once. It came in signs. Small, sharp, unmistakable. The first warning came at dawn. A fence post near the southern edge of her property split in 2. Hoofprints where there shouldn't have been any. A single cigar but pressed into the dirt, still warm. They hadn't just come for a chat. They'd been back. The second warning came hours later. Her mailbox, empty, bent backward, like someone had pried it open with a knife. It wasn't about mail. It was a message. A reminder that she was being watched. And didn't panic. She had lived too long to mistake fear for surprise. She walked the perimeter of her ranch slowly, counting steps, breathing through the weight in her chest. In another life, this kind of walk meant the difference between making it home and coming back in a body bag. She remembered the feel of the sand beneath her boots in Iran, how the first sign of danger was never the explosion itself. It was the silence that came before it. And that silence was back. In town, whispers about the cowboys grew louder. At the bar, someone mentioned a takeover. At the diner, they spoke about N's land like it was already sold. No one warned her, because no one dared to. Around here, power wasn't in the law. Power wore cowboy hats and carried revolvers. But something happened that none of them expected. Someone left a note, slipped beneath her door. Just 3 words, written in shaky handwriting. "They'll come soon." And stared at that note for a long time. It could have been a warning. It could have been a trap. Either way, it meant they weren't hiding anymore. She walked to the old trunk at the foot of her bed, the trunk that hadn't been opened in years. Its hinges groaned like they were remembering something. Inside, wrapped in faded army cloth, was her rifle, a sniper's rifle, the same weapon she carried through places where people didn't come back. Beside it, a single photograph, a younger Anne, in combat uniform, standing with a team whose faces were half shadow, half legend. She wiped the dust off the barrel with steady hands. Every movement muscle memory. No hesitation. No tremor. Just precision. And Washington hadn't just survived war. She became it. But even as she prepared, she thought about the town. The sheriff who looked the other way. The families too afraid to speak. The young men who wore their father's hatred like a second skin. This wasn't just about her land. It was about what happens when a system lets darkness grow. In the distance, she saw the glow of headlights, lingering too long at the crossroads. A car, watching, waiting, testing how far it could get before the real strike. That night, and locked every door, secured every window, sat on the porch with her back against the wood, rifle across her lap. She wasn't afraid of the night. The night was afraid of her. And somewhere out there, the cowboys laughed, because men like them believe they own tomorrow. But in Washington, she was done letting tomorrow belong to them. This time, they'd meet the woman behind the rumors. If your safety was threatened and the law refused to protect you, would you trust the system? Or would you take justice into your own hands? Tell me in the comments, because your answer says more than you think. Night fell hard, like a curtain drawn over the stage of a play where everyone already knows the ending, except the fools on horseback. The cowboys thought they were the hunters. But on this night, they'd just stepped onto the chessboard of someone who spent a lifetime turning darkness into advantage. And Washington didn't pace. She didn't panic. She moved through her house the way a soldier moves through memory, calculated, quiet, patient. Her hands steady, her breath controlled. This wasn't fear. This was muscle memory. The kind of memory forged under scorching suns and midnight raids in deserts far from home. She'd built her life here, but war never left her veins. Out by the tree line, 7 shadows moved like a ripple of poison. They weren't silent because they were skilled. They were silent because they thought no one was listening. But Anne was. She'd been listening long before the wind carried their stench to her porch. She planted a motion sensor under the old magnolia tree years ago. It was meant to keep coyotes off her land. Tonight, it would map out the positions of men who thought a woman's age made her a victim. First mistake. The oldest cowboy, Earl Red Hickson, thought he'd seen it all. Thought a few flickering porch lights meant no threat. He didn't notice the angle of the shadows. He didn't see the faint green glimmer of the scope lens reflecting from the kitchen window. But Anne, she saw everything. At exactly 11:48 p.m., she lifted her rifle. Not to shoot. Not yet. But to watch. She wanted them to feel safe. She wanted them to believe the night was still theirs. Earl sent 2 toward the barn, 2 toward the stables, 1 to circle behind the kitchen door. Classic flanking maneuver. If your opponent is a frightened civilian. But in Washington is not, and never was, a frightened anything. Then a deliberate metallic snap of a tripwire behind the barn. A cowboy screams. Second mistake. Panic is like blood in the water. 1 mistake becomes 2, then 5. They broke formation. They shouted names. They forgot what silence means on a battlefield. And Anne, well, she thrived in chaos. 1 shot. Not to kill, but to send a message. The bullet kissed the lantern an inch from Earl's ear. Flames danced against his cheek, burning away the arrogance that had carried him here. He dropped to the ground, heart hammering against a reality he'd never prepared for. They came for a helpless woman. They found a ghost from a war they'd never fought. The ambush wasn't loud. It wasn't bloody. It was surgical. A masterpiece painted in shadow and fear. 1 man with a broken ankle. Another bleeding from a grazing shot. The others frozen, because they finally understood this ranch wasn't theirs. She could have ended it right there. 7 lives snuffed out like porch candles. But in Washington wasn't hunting for bodies. She was hunting for truth. And truth, like prey, runs fastest when it thinks it can still escape. The night was no longer their playground. It was her battlefield. And as the cowboys crawled through the dirt they once claimed to own, they didn't realize the real hunt hadn't even begun. The night shifted. Not in a scream. Not in a gunshot. But in the quiet. where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The ambush was over. The real storm was just beginning. Earl Hickson knelt in the dirt, the same dirt he thought he ruled. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with dust and fear. 2 of his men were on the ground, one limping, one bleeding. The other 4 crouched behind broken fences, trying to make sense of the ghost that was tearing their pride apart. And Washington watched from the shadows of her porch. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. Every second of their panic fed her calm. A sniper's greatest power isn't the bullet. It's the silence before it. They still didn't understand. They were fighting a woman who spent years waiting in sandstorms for targets that never showed their faces. This wasn't a fight. This was a reckoning. One of them, young Clyde Bennett, barely 22, made the mistake of moving first. A flash of blonde hair. A foot on loose gravel. He thought the barn would protect him. He never saw the shot coming. Third mistake. First blood. Rage has no aim. Fear has no discipline. Their bullets tore into wood, fence posts, and empty night. Not one came close to Anne. She was gone before the first shot echoed, and was already moving. Position 2. Higher ground. Perfect angle. Second bullet wasn't meant to kill. Just to remind them they weren't hunters anymore. They were prey. Earl grabbed Clyde's body by the collar, dragging it through the dust. But it wasn't Clyde's weight slowing him down. It was the weight of something heavier. The weight of realizing this woman they came to terrorize, was dismantling them piece by piece. One of them, Jacob Bull Carter, whispered, "She ain't human." But Anne was human. Just a different kind. The kind the world forgets, until it's too late. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't rise. She wasn't killing out of rage. She was executing a plan carved into muscle memory decades ago. They tried to get clever, flanking her from both sides. But they didn't know that Anne grew up flanking men who trained for war. They were bringing a knife to a sniper's battlefield. 4 men down, 3 left, the air thick with dust and dread. For the first time, Earl felt something he'd never admit. Not fear of death, fear of justice. This was the night everything he built, his power, his connections, his untouchable image, would turn to dust. Blood in the dust. His men scattered like hunted animals. The porch light flickered in the distance like the eye of something ancient. Watching. Waiting. But Anne Washington didn't celebrate the shots she fired. She carried every one like a stone in her chest. Because every bullet carried a memory. A past she thought she'd buried in foreign sand. And as the last 3 cowboys regrouped near the rusted water tank, and whispered something to herself the night could barely hear. The dust held the blood. The land held the truth. And the war they started had finally met a warrior. As the dust settled over the ranch, the silence changed. It wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of something remembered. The bodies on the ground weren't just cowboys anymore. They were ghosts dragging old memories out of the corners of Anne Washington's mind. She felt it again. The desert heat. The smell of sand and iron. The echo of distant mortars. She wasn't standing on her porch anymore. She was back in the war. Iran. Afghanistan. Operations the world never learned about. And wasn't just another soldier. She was the whisper in the dark. The one enemy commanders warned their men about. Her codename was Blackbird. And she left behind a trail of silence. But silence has a way of echoing back when you least expect it. The 3 remaining cowboys were scattered and bleeding. But one of them wasn't just anyone. Under the moonlight, as Anne's scope fixed on his trembling hands, she saw it, a tattoo. A small falcon etched on the inside of his forearm. A falcon she hadn't seen in decades. Her finger froze on the trigger. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. That symbol belonged to the unit she dismantled in 2004. A black market militia smuggling weapons into conflict zones. A unit whose leader never forgave her. It wasn't a random raid. These men didn't just stumble onto her ranch. They came for her. And in that single broken word, her past bled into the night. The name she buried 20 years ago had just been spoken again. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a reckoning. Anne's breath came shallow. Her grip loosened. She wasn't facing cowboys anymore. She was facing unfinished business. The leader of that militia had 2 sons. One was killed in the war. The other disappeared. She wondered for years if he was out there. If vengeance would ever find her doorstep. Tonight it had. The man she had in her scope wasn't just a stranger. He was the ghost she knew would one day knock. The look on his face said everything. He wasn't here to rob her. He was here to end her. Sometimes, war doesn't stay buried. It follows you home. It learns your address. It waits for a night like this. The hunter had found her. And Washington was never the prey. Not then. Not now. And in that cold, still moment under a Texas moon, the past and present became one battlefield. The night had grown colder. The stars overhead burned sharp and clear, watching like silent witnesses. Inside the old barn, one man still breathed. Broken, bleeding, cornered, and had dragged him from the dirt into the place where her past lived in boxes. Crates marked with years she tried to forget. A barn that smelled of hay, gun oil, and old ghosts. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just watched her through eyes that carried a memory too deep for a stranger. For the first time tonight, the violence stopped moving. The ranch wasn't a battlefield. It was a confession room. And then he said the name. The one she hadn't heard spoken in 20 years. That single word cut deeper than any bullet ever had. He spoke of a boy who grew up in the shadow of war. A boy who watched his father disappear into a conflict he didn't start. A boy who learned that revenge was easier to inherit than grief. That boy grew into a man with a falcon tattoo. A man who was told that the woman named Blackbird stole everything from him. His father was the leader of the militia she dismantled. The one she swore she had neutralized for good. But legends have a way of leaving unfinished echoes. He admitted they'd been searching for her for years. Not because she was a name in the wind, but because she was the only one who made them afraid. And beneath that laugh she heard it. Not rage, not hatred, just a tired, broken man who grew up chasing a ghost. For the first time, the lines blurred. Predator, prey, soldier, son, blackbird, enemy. They were all the same shape under the same cruel moon. In the golden light, she saw him not as a raider, but as the last echo of a war she left unfinished. He confessed everything. How they trained for this night. How they tracked her. How this was supposed to end in fire and blood. But now, tied to a beam, bleeding out into the dirt of her barn, he saw the woman he'd hunted wasn't the monster he imagined. She was flesh, bone, and history. The truth is a strange thing. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It just sits in the room with you, waiting for what comes next. She could have ended it right there. One bullet. One clean shot. Just like she was trained to. But instead she listened. The hunter and the hunted now sat in the same silence. And in that final breath, he gave her a name, a location, a promise. This wasn't the end. This was only the first wave. The real storm was still out there, waiting. And as the night crept on, and Washington knew one truth, the war she left behind had finally come home. Dawn came quietly like a thief. But this morning, it wouldn't be the sun that greeted the plains. It would be blood. It would be the reckoning. And Washington, 68 years old, stands at the edge of her porch. The same porch where she raised her children. The same porch where her husband once told her, "This land will outlive all of us." But as the first ray of sunlight touches her face, she knows this land is about to be baptized in war. The cowboys thought the night had broken her spirit. But what they don't know is that dawn has always been her hour. Back in Afghanistan, she was called the Ghost of Cost. A sniper who saw the world clearest when the sun kissed the horizon. They are riding straight into a world she already knows how to kill in. 7 horses. 5 men left. 1 woman with a rifle and nothing left to lose. And steps off the porch. She walks slowly toward the barn. Not hiding. Not running. Her boots crunch against the frozen soil like a metronome of death. In her mind, this is not her ranch anymore. It's a battlefield. And she's home again. For a second, the fields around her melt away. She's 25 again, eyes sharp, breath steady. She smells diesel and blood. She hears the sound of a distant call sign, Ghost 9. Her hands stop shaking. The cowboys dismount. No more jokes now. They've seen their brothers fall. Fear sits heavy on their faces, but pride keeps them walking forward. In their world, a black woman is supposed to be scared. But this morning, they are the prey. And lifts the sniper she once swore she'd never use again. A relic of her past, but cleaner than any memory. She breathes in once, slowly. And with that breath, she lets go of everything that made her ordinary. A single gunshot cracks the air. 1 cowboy falls. Screams. Horses panic. The war begins not with a storm, but with a single bullet. Rapid gunfire exchange. and doesn't run. She moves like a phantom between the trees. Every step planned. Every shot measured. For every bullet they send, she gives back something colder. These men rode in believing this would be a raid. Now they know, this is an execution ground. But even in war, Anne's eyes never lose their calculation. She doesn't shoot to kill all. She leaves some breathing. Because every battlefield has witnesses, and every ghost needs a story told. The last two cowboys shout, panicked. One drops his weapon. Another fires blindly. The final two aren't soldiers. They're boys with hate in their veins and fear in their hearts. And for the first time, they see her for what she is. Not an old woman. Not a victim. But the storm they created. And as the last echoes of gunfire disappear into the waking sky, the land breathes again. The birds return. But nothing is the same. When evil thinks it can silence the forgotten, it always meets someone who remembers. Someone who's been waiting. But remember, this isn't the end of the war. Because behind every bullet fired at dawn, there's a consequence waiting in daylight. Tell me in the comments, if someone brought war to your doorstep, would you fight, or would you forgive? By the time the law decides to show up, the war is already over. The field in front of Anne's ranch lies quiet now. Smoke drifts lazily over broken fence posts. The horses are long gone, and 5 men will never ride again. The sheriff's convoy rolls in like a funeral procession, slow, heavy, carrying not justice, but suspicion. They're not here to protect her. They're here to clean up a mess she wasn't supposed to survive. Sheriff Dalton, a man who's been shaking hands with these cowboys long before they learned to shoot straight. A man who called himself the law, but spent years looking the other way. His boots crunch on the gravel like a man walking on a story he's trying to bury. He stares at and like she's the problem. An old black woman standing on her porch, rifle leaning against the door frame. Blood on the soil. Truth in the air. But the problem with truth is that it doesn't bow to power. Dalton knows these men. He drank whiskey with them, laughed with them, covered for them. Now they're dead, and that means someone has to pay. And in this town, it's never the guilty who pay. Deputies scatter around the ranch like vultures around a carcass, snapping pictures, whispering. One of them recognizes the patch sewn inside Anne's old military jacket. A sniper's insignia, a ghost of wars this town never cared to understand. The sheriff speaks, not like a man seeking truth, but like a man writing a story before the ink even hits the paper. He wants a villain. He wants control. He wants this old woman to be afraid. But Anne Washington has walked through battlefields far colder than this. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't even look away. Years ago, she faced men with more power, more guns, and more cruelty than Dalton will ever know. And every one of them underestimated her. Every one of them regretted it. Dalton threatens her with arrest. She answers with silence. And in that silence, something shifts. The sheriff realizes what the cowboys never did. She isn't the prey. She's the survivor they can't control. But make no mistake, power never dies quietly. Dalton isn't here for justice. He's here to bury her story before it spreads. Because if the town learns that an old black woman outgunned their untouchable boys, everything changes. He wants to make an example of her. But what he doesn't know is that this isn't the first time Anne's been framed. And it won't be the first time she turns the tables. And so, under a pale morning sky, the real war begins. Not with guns, but with truth, lies, and power. Tell me in the comments, do you trust the law when the law protects the wrong people? Because in towns like this, justice isn't blind. It just looks the other way. The walls are cold. The light hums. And the room smells like fear. Not Anne's, but theirs. Hours after the gunfire faded, and Washington sits in an interrogation room. Hands cuffed. Wrists steady. Across from her, Sheriff Dalton. His badge shines, but his soul is rusted. This isn't about truth. This is about control. The sheriff leans forward, eyes like a man trying to rewrite history before it escapes him. He doesn't want the facts. He wants the version that keeps his power intact. He calls her a murderer, a vigilante, a dangerous old woman who snapped. He uses words like public safety and self-defense gone too far. Words designed not to find justice, but to erase it. But Anne doesn't play their game. She doesn't plead. She doesn't explain. She watches. She listens. She remembers every face she saw at the ranch that night. Dalton tries to corner her with questions that sound like accusations. Why were you armed? Why didn't you call us? Why so many shots fired? But he never asks the question that matters. Why were they there in the first place? He wants to break her, but he's forgetting who she is. She's faced interrogations before, not with words, but with bombs in the distance and blood on the ground. In war zones, men like Dalton didn't scare her. They feared her, and lets him talk, because predators reveal their intentions in their noise, and Dalton is making plenty of it. Finally, she lifts her head, and for the first time, he sees something in her eyes that makes him pause. Not anger, not fear, discipline, the kind soldiers carry when they've survived more than anyone can imagine. He knows. He's losing control of the story. There's talk in the hallway. One of the younger deputies, fresh out of the academy, saw the bodies, saw the rifles they carried, saw the symbols etched on their jackets. Proof they were part of something darker. Proof Dalton has been hiding for years. He leans closer. He doesn't want the truth to breathe. But the truth doesn't need permission to exist. Anne's silence is louder than his accusations. And in that silence, he realizes something terrifying. She isn't the one on trial. He is. The door slams behind him. But the room stays warm, because truth lingers like smoke. It doesn't go away just because someone walks out. In that moment, Anne smiles for the first time. Not out of joy, but because she knows exactly what's coming. They thought they could cage her with handcuffs. They forgot she's been through bigger wars than this. Tell me in the comments, if the people in power tried to silence your truth, would you speak, or would you let the silence speak for you? By sunrise, the silence that once cloaked Anne's ranch is shattered. The air is filled with the hum of satellite vans, reporters, and flashing lights. The story has escaped. What began as a night of violence in the middle of nowhere is now a breaking headline on every major network. Elderly woman defends herself in deadly ranch shootout. Vigilante justice in Texas countryside. Race, revenge, and survival. The mystery behind the retired sniper. They don't know her name yet. Not really. To them, she's just the widow of the West, a faceless symbol of defiance. But for those who do know, the leak cuts deep. The military files, the classified missions, her hidden past. It's all out now. Someone somewhere wanted this story to burn. On social media, the world divides itself in real time. Some hail her as a hero, a warrior standing up against hate and corruption. Others paint her as a murderer, a cold-blooded killer hiding behind age and race. And in between the noise, the truth gasps for air. Video clips leak, grainy drone footage of the ranch, police scanners screaming for backup. Even the body cam of a terrified deputy whispering, "She's ex-military, we're outmatched." The sheriff's department rushes to contain the narrative. Statements are rewritten. Evidence disappears. But the story won't die. Investigative journalists dig deeper, finding links between the slain cowboys, local corruption, and a network of cover-ups stretching back years. The same cowboys who harassed black families with police protection, now exposed for who they truly were. But here's the question the media won't ask. Why did Anne's file suddenly surface now? Who leaked it, and why? Was it justice, or revenge? Anne watches the broadcast alone, her face dimly lit by the TV glow. Her story, her pain, twisted into headlines for the world's consumption. Every secret she buried now belongs to strangers. And yet, somewhere deep down, she knows this exposure might be the only way for the truth to breathe. For once, the darkness she fought in silence has a witness. The media may have turned her life into spectacle, but the world is finally listening. And when a legend's story leaks into daylight, there's no going back. The smoke has cleared. The gunfire has long since faded into the night. But the echoes of that night on the ranch will not be forgotten. And stands alone on her porch, not as a victim, not as a criminal, but as a woman whose truth can no longer be buried. The ranch is scarred, the land bears witness, but the legend has already left its mark. In the towns around, people whisper. In the cities beyond, they debate. And across the country, her name spreads like wildfire. To some, she's the old woman who defended her home. To others, she's the ghost of a forgotten war. But to those who understand, she is proof that silence can be deadly, and survival can be a story all its own. The media calls her a legend. But legends aren't born in front of cameras. They're forged in the quiet moments no one sees. In choices that change everything. The sheriff's cover-ups crumble. The cowboys' reign ends. And the town, once blind to its rot, must finally look itself in the mirror. But here's the real question. Was Anne a hero, or simply a woman forced to do what no one else would? What would you have done if the world left you with no choice? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. Years from now, when people pass through this dusty road, they won't remember the cowboys. They'll remember her. The woman who stood alone. The woman who refused to bow. The woman whose silence was more dangerous than their noise. Legends don't ask for permission to be remembered. They simply live on. Weeks pass. The headlines fade. The reporters pack their cameras. The world moves on. But legends don't die with the news cycle. They linger. Anne's ranch is quiet again. Or at least, that's what it looks like. The fences are rebuilt. The fields are still. But beneath the calm, something is shifting. One evening, as the sun melts into the horizon, a black sedan pulls up on the dirt path outside her gate. No reporters. No lawmen. Just one man in a dark suit, holding a slim leather folder. He doesn't knock. He just waits. And somehow, Anne already knows who he is. Not his name, but his kind. Inside that folder isn't a threat. It's a message. A reminder that the war she thought she left behind may not be over. A single line, typed on a yellowed sheet of paper. They found her. And lowers the page, and for the first time in years, a faint smile touches her lips. Not out of joy, but out of recognition. The hunter in her never really slept. Legends don't retire. They rise again when the world least expects it.